appreciate you coming and talking to us. And I'll hand over to you now and to the swinging of the Zoom pendulum over to you, okay?
Thank you. And for me, this is actually a return. In 1980, I was the visiting poet in residence at the University of Texas at Dallas, when you had, I think, only 3 buildings and no freshmen and sophomores. So this is a kind of homecoming for me too. So it's a pleasure to at least virtually be back in Richardson. I'm going to talk more about the crisis in our world and in our lives rather than the crisis of the humanities, but ask the question of how can the humanities approach these crises in a way that is helpful both to the individual and perhaps to society. Reiner told me, whatever you do, don't read a lecture, but this is such a complicated subject, I felt necessary to write some stuff down. So I'll try to read it in an interesting way. And it's a good thing that Reiner is on mute, probably. A few years ago, I appeared on a playwriting panel at the Tennessee Williams Literary Festival with John Patrick Shanley, the 1988 Academy Award-winning screenwriter of Moonstruck, and the 2005 Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright of Doubt. That play focuses on a conflict between a Catholic school principal and a parish priest whom she suspects of abusing a student. A young nun, unsure of the truth, is caught between the two as the principal pursues with relentless certainty a case against the priest. Let me show you the trailer for the film, which will give you a sense of the characters involved. Christy and I have been practicing for 2 days now, so I hope all this technology actually works. Let me try to share my screen.
He's sharing a video.
To be alert. I am concerned.
So that's why you might not be able to see his face. But
Chemically?
No, I see the video now.
okay.
What's this?
So do you see the video on your
Sister? They're all uniformly terrified of you.
No, that was on it. I clicked on it.
Come up here.
Dragon is hungry. It's time, sister. Which needs to change.
The point being?
We should be friendlier.
Father Flynn, he called Donald Miller to the rectory.
So, it's happened. We are going to have to stop him ourselves. What happened in the rectory?
Happened. Nothing happened. I had a talk with a boy.
What about?
Private matter.
He's 12 years old. What could be private?
You have the slightest proof of anything.
But I have my certainty.
I can fight you.
You will lose.
Why you gotta know something like that for sure when you don't? You come to your school, kids don't like him. One man is good to him, this priest.
It is unsettling to look at people with suspicion. I feel less close to God.
When you take a step to address wrongdoing, you are taking a step away from God, but in his service.
You are single-handedly holding this parish back.
What are you doing in this school?
There are people who go after your humanity. They tell you that the light in your heart is a weakness. Don't believe it.
You just don't like him. You were letting that convince you of something terrible.
Look at that. You blew out my light.
What did you hear? What did you see that convinced you so thoroughly?
I don't think Father Flynn did anything wrong.
You just want things to be resolved so you can have simplicity back.
Doubt can be a bond as powerful as certainty.
I'll throw your son out of this school. You hurt my son to get your way.
You have no right to act on your own. You have no right.
I will do what needs to be done. You should understand that, or you will mistake me.
So, well, So that gives a picture, I think, of the characters involved in the basic stakes. And as the play ends, having succeeded in forcing the priest's resignation, the principal begins to doubt her own actions, as you'll see in this final short clip.
His resignation was his confession. He was what I thought he was. And he's gone.
I can't believe you lied.
In the pursuit of wrongdoing, one steps away from God. Of course, there is a price.
I see.
Oh, Sister James. Is it, sister? I have doubts. I have such doubts.
There we go. The audience at our panel discussion questioned Mr. Shanley about whether the play wasn't really about pedophile priests. He strongly disputed that, insisting that he chose the title because the play was about certainty versus doubt. The question of certainty versus doubt had enormous consequences in 2004, when the invasion of Iraq had been predicated on the Bush administration's assurances that there could be no doubt that Saddam Hussein controlled weapons of mass destruction, assurances which proved completely false. Some of you may even remember that France raised doubts over the administration's certainty about the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And outraged by such doubts, Republican chairman of the Committee on House Administration, Bob Ney, renamed French fries as freedom fries on the menu of 3 congressional cafeterias. Let me do something slightly different in terms of the sharing that we're doing, so I can have some illustrations we might talk about as we pursue this in more detail and see what Shanley had to say. This will take just a moment. There we go. As you can see, Shanley put forward a statement finally about this dispute on what the real subject of the play was. Doubt requires more courage than conviction does, and more energy, because conviction is a resting place and doubt is infinite. It is a passionate exercise. You may come out of my play uncertain. You may want to be sure. Look down on that feeling. We've got to learn to live with a full measure of uncertainty. There is no last word. That's the silence under the chatter of our time. We continue to live in a culture bedeviled by certainty, with opinions fossilized by partisan politics. Since 2015, that certainty has expressed itself most surprisingly by swelling contempt for higher education, seen by some as undermining solidarity of belief. And some of you may be familiar with a particular research chart by Pew Research Center, which indicated that starting, as you can see, in 2016, Republicans began to drop from roughly 65% of support for higher education to 36%. And it continued through the Trump administration, hovering at a very low feature when they were asked, do colleges and universities have a negative effect on the way things are going in the country? So an extraordinary thing had happened, as this shows. So considering the fact that many fellow Americans view higher education as a threat to the future of the country, right? I thought it'd be useful to trace the origins of education in the West by examining early references to arts and humanities in Greece and their link to pedagogical models that we follow. Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet, proclaims that he has been inspired by the muses of Mount Helicon to narrate the birth of the gods in his Theogony. And so he begins with the conception of the muses themselves. And this is Hesiod. Their father was Zeus, son of Kronos. Their mother, who mated with him, was Mnemosyne. They were born to be the forgetting of misfortunes and the cessation of worries. For 9 nights did Zeus the planner lie coupled with their mother, entering her holy bed, remote from the immortals. When a year was up and the seasons came round, as the months were waning and the many days were coming to fulfillment, she gave birth to 9 daughters, all like-minded, who have song on their minds in their breast. In speaking of the muses, we often forget to mention that their Titan mother, Mnemosyne, was the goddess of memory. But Hesiod tells us that they were born to be the forgetting of misfortunes and the cessation of worries. So memory spawns imagination in its various guises, through which we forget misfortunes and are distracted from our worries. To speak of the imagination is to suggest, as commonly misunderstood, that the muses are the inspiration exclusively of the arts, especially since their mentor is Apollo, the Olympian god of music and poetry, and thus of order and beauty. In fact, Clio is the protector of history, and Urania of astronomy. Thalia is said to have discovered architecture and agriculture. Polymnia is credited with the invention of geometry and grammar. So if we seek the mother and the founding daughters of the arts and humanities, Mnemosyne and the 9 muses are the most obvious progenitors. Speaking at an institution of higher education, I can trace this university too to these female divinities. For as we find in Plato's The Laws, when the Athenian asks, shall we postulate that education owes its origin to Apollo and the muses? Plato's Clinias answers yes. While conceding that Eugene McDermott, J. Eric Johnson, and Cecil Green played a more immediate role in the founding of the University of Texas at Dallas, we can ascribe some credit to Apollo for his tutoring of the muses, and thus for the very notion of education in the arts, humanities, and sciences that your generous benefactors sought to underwrite. Just as we mistakenly imagine the muses as the inspiration only of the arts, we are short-sighted in mistaking Apollo as the Greek god only of music and poetry. The giver of laws, he is also associated with medicine and plagues, archery and agriculture, and most strikingly of knowledge and prophecy. If we ask the purpose of education in its simplest form, is it not knowledge and prophecy? For is not the task of education to transmit the accumulated knowledge of the past and to prepare students to predict the future based on a rigorous analysis of the present? It is the Apollonian balance of knowledge and prophecy, which is to say memory and imagination, that leads us to the subject of this series of lectures, the future of the arts and humanities in times of crisis. If we may linger among the Greeks for just a few more moments, we might counterpose, rather than knowledge and prophecy, another pairing, episteme, the Greek term usually translated as knowledge, and techne, translated as craft or art. As Richard Perry points out, ancient Greeks would not have thought of these terms as we moderns might, as theory versus practice, but as interdependent and sometimes identical. In their meaning and functioning, we may assume that the humanities seek to provide bodies of existing knowledge, the domains of memory, while the arts offer training and technique to allow students to invent artistic expressions that reframe the present and project the future, both expressions of the imagination. This pairing of memory and imagination is latent in the dual and perhaps dueling Latin etymologies of education, the word, which opposes tradition and innovation in the same word, as Randall Bass and J.W. Good explain in educare and educere is a balance possible in the educational system. And I'll read this to you, the underlined part. Maurice Kraft noted that there are two different Latin roots of the English word education. They are educare, which means to train or to mold, and educere, meaning to lead out. While the two meanings are quite different, they are both represented in the word education. Thus, there is an etymological basis for many of the vociferous debates about education today. The opposing sides often use the same word to denote two very different concepts. One side uses education to mean the preservation and passing down of knowledge and the shaping of youth in the image of their parents. The other side sees education as preparing a new generation for the changes that are to come, readying them to create solutions to problems yet unknown. One calls for rote memorization and becoming good workers. The other requires questioning, thinking, and creating. To further complicate matters, some groups expect schooling to fulfill both functions, but allow only those activities promoting educare to be used. As Plato describes in the Phaedon, in 399 BC, the Athenian courts convicted the philosopher Socrates of impiety, declaring he was corrupting the youth and had failed to worship the city's gods. The Socratic method, which as a vehicle of critical thinking is dedicated to educere, perhaps at the expense of educare, was at least partially responsible for the fateful verdict of the city fathers. We are likely to condemn that verdict, but if John Patrick Shanley is right, we have an obligation to doubt or at least to question our judgment of those upright Athenians who condemned to death a slovenly old teacher. My own experience of educere has made clear its cost not only to teachers like Socrates, who too stridently probe community verities, but also to students who may be left unmoored by an educational experience that challenges rather than confirms their worldview. Yeah, I have to explain this one. I'm about to talk about my 50 years as a college teacher. And I just wanted to prove, yeah, it really has been 50 years. And I might also point out, when the local newspaper published this photograph, they felt the need to include captions so that readers would be able to tell who was Tolstoy. This is my 50th year of college teaching, a half century in which higher education has undergone nearly constant change. As my wife once noted, before photocopying became available to classroom teachers, the biggest technological challenge 50 years ago was how to get rid of the purple stains on clothing from typed ditto reproduction masters. Now, though, the pace of technological change in education is accelerating. In just the last 12 months, for example, I've gone from lecturing in a classroom with a blackboard to offering synchronous and asynchronous online courses on Zoom. But a much greater change in technology was already underway when I first joined a college faculty. At the end of my first year of university teaching, when I look like that, I had coffee with a retiring professor on the same day we received our course evaluations for the spring semester. The old man held up the summary sheet of his student evaluations and sighed. You know, he told me, when I was in school, it wasn't the job of a teacher to be interesting. It was the job of the student to find a way to be interested in whatever the teacher was saying. My colleague's view was that the task of higher education had been to lead the student out of himself or herself to learn to inhabit another perspective, another mind. In other words, educere. Of course, such a pedagogical approach seeds doubt in a student about previously held beliefs and challenges previously inculcated values. Some years after that conversation, I offered a course in the history of the idea of the self. When we came to Descartes and discussed his discourse on method, one of my students from the large expatriate Vietnamese community in New Orleans was waiting for me at my office door after class. The French philosopher's formulation, cogito ergo sum, had left her in tears. I asked her why she was crying. It's horrible what he wrote. So lonely, she said. Well, I responded, how would you rephrase it? Rephrased in a very different non-Western culture, she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She said, "We are, therefore I am." That weeping student had experienced the full force of educere. For her, the great skeptic Descartes had been the serpent in the garden who introduced her to the path out of Eden, doubt, and thus self-awareness, consciousness. To doubt received wisdom, then, is an objective veducere in the transmission of the arts and humanities. And that is what the serpent teaches Eve, as we can see in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. And let's just take a quick look at that. And I'll read this to you. Now, this is, of course, the King James translation. "Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasing to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." So the typical reading of this, of course, is that the serpent deceives Eve. Okay, but watch what God says at the end of the following verses. "And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldst not eat? And the man said, The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become as one of us to know good and evil. And let me change so I can see the rest of this, if I can. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him forth from the garden to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the garden Eden cherubims, with a fiery sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. In fact, if we look at the text, the serpent has not lied at all, because Eve doesn't die, Adam doesn't die. And the great fear of the one who has forbidden it is that they will become like unto us. Now that they are self-conscious, all they lack for divinity is immortality, and they have to be driven from the garden before they bite of the fruit which would immortalize them. So we can see that in Genesis, perhaps the oldest of the books of the Old Testament, already doubt is latent in the text if we simply open our eyes, as Eve had her eyes open, and read it. Okay? The serpent doesn't lie. The serpent, in fact, tells the truth. It's God who has lied to Eve and to Adam. Okay? That's what educere does. It opens your eyes to realities to which you were blinded. But what then is the role of educare in the functioning of the arts and humanities in times of crisis? A cynical teacher might point out that students bring to the classroom little acquaintance with the great works of world art, literature, and the humanities. So mustn't the university first provide a knowledge of enduring works before attempting, in a term fashionable a quarter century ago, to deconstruct them? But such an assertion will be met by objections to the very notion of great or enduring works, as debates over the canon have elaborated, with the beneficial result of widening the range of voices studied. So the circulation of reading lists, a fundamental element of undergraduate education when I was a student, is viewed as problematic today. From a writer's point of view, the loss of common readings has robbed contemporary literature of the enrichment of a text through allusions. In discussing this problem with one of my writing workshops, I suggested that the last literary figure to whom an author might intelligibly allude is Homer. And this is a completely true story. The students looked up wide-eyed and responded, Simpson? Never mind, I said. You can't allude to anyone. In fact, when I Googled Homer for this talk to illustrate this point, I was presented with 4 images of the Greek poet and 20 images of Mr. Simpson from which to choose. Deprived of a readership that shares common readings or increasingly common values, authors must negotiate the gap between doubt and certainty on their own. Literature may once have been expected to instruct and delight, but most modern authors reject the notion that they are offering their readers lessons. Still, something akin to edicere, seems to be the effect of serious literature, awakening a reader to new perspectives rather than merely confirming biases. 3 writers illuminate the complexity of their task and the depth of their doubts in times of crisis. Late in 1917, for example, a German-speaking Swiss author, Robert Walser, expresses doubts about daily life in responding to a letter which Hermann Hesse alludes to in his own wartime duties. This is Walser writing back to Hesse. Word is going around that Robert Walser is leading the noble life of a dreamer, idler, and petit bourgeois instead of fighting. The politicians are dissatisfied with me, but what do people really want? And what greater good aims can be achieved by articles in newspapers and in magazines? When the world is out of joint, the efforts of 20,000 Hamlets are no use at all, or precious little. Every day I read a little French because it is such a pretty language. Does that make me a rascal? And then I can't help walking around every day a bit in the winter countryside. Does that prove I'm indifferent to a great deal of suffering? I believe you understand better than anyone why I like to live a quiet and thoughtful life. But Walser is willing to indict indifference to suffering with absolute certainty, even if he immediately begins to doubt the possibility of the morality he recommends. And this is Walser in one of his meditations. Is the peacock not a little uneasy? Does this adult gentleman who goes about so beautifully not feel in any way whatsoever concerned when he sees dirty, speckled little children? It seems to me that no mature man ought to want to appear all elegance as long as there are children who have no finery to wear at all. This is, of course, asking too much. And if anyone were to wait content and enjoying life until finally the world should contain no more poor, miserable people, then he would be waiting until the gray, impenetrable end of all time, and until the ice-cold, empty end of the world. And by then, all joy and life itself would in all probability be utterly gone from him. So you can see in the midst of a single paragraph in which he demands adults to subsume their own vanity in favor of starving children, he starts to doubt himself and begins to say, well, no, this morality is absolutely impossible. And where would we be since there'll always be poor, miserable people? This doubting is contained in all of the writers I looked at in preparing this, particularly in Albert Camus. Similarly, the French Nobel Prize winner Albert Camus is absolute in his moral demands, but equivocal about imposing them on others, exactly the same as Walser. In 1943, in the middle of the next World War, he sends an unsigned letter from Paris to Charles de Gaulle in London with the title, From a Resisting Intellectual. Once again, like Walser, he reflects a complex moral stance about his wartime activities. And this is actually the letter from one of the archives. Here, I very briefly summarize the feelings of a French intellectual, he writes, in the face of the current situation as it can be observed from within the interior. To put it plainly, one's first feelings would be those of anguish. My deep conviction is that the form of war that metropolitan France has adopted, and in which we are all engaged, can lead either to the rebirth of this people or to its definitive fall. He fears a future that far too much resembles the past, in which, under the pretext of liberty, justice is put deliberately to one side. As for the ideology of the French resistance, if we have a doctrine to formulate, it would be one of a balance of justice and of liberty, certainly difficult to realize, but outside of which nothing can be done. He goes on to say in this letter to de Gaulle, And this double feeling of anguish and uncertainty defines the climate in which most French people live. It would be childish to believe that this leads at the same time to discouragement. Quite precisely the opposite is true. But once again, those who have taken charge of the country's external destiny should not ignore the turmoil that accompanies most minds here. Justice and freedom cannot be mutually exclusive and are still essential for rebuilding the world and opposing the destructive logics of history. The distinguished scholar Robert Zareski points out that for Camus, if we make any claims for moral universality, we must also accept that other choices by other people in the same situation can be equally good and equally defensible. As Adam Gopnik has written, at the time Camus wrote his letter, resistance was not a self-congratulatory rhetorical position, but a life or death risk taken every day. And yet he was still prepared to put his life on the line for the view that there is no one line to follow in life. Giles Harvey, in a New York Times profile of British Nobel Prize winner Kazuo Ishiguro, to be published this coming Sunday, in fact, recounts an event as the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Empire lurched toward an unpredictable climax that crystallized the young writer's commitment, like Walser and Camus, to doubting his own moral judgments. And this is from the article, the profile. On a bright, cool Saturday in late October 1983, the growing prospect of thermonuclear war between the two world superpowers drew 250,000 people out into the streets of central London. Among them was a young writer named Kazuo Ishiguro, who'd recently published his first novel. Ishiguro's mother had narrowly survived the atomic bombing of Nagasaki in 1945, so his presence at the march that day felt like a matter of personal duty. Along with a group of like-minded friends, he chanted slogans demanding that the West renounce its nuclear arsenal, the hope being that the East would quickly follow suit. As they made their way past Big Ben to Hyde Park, holding signs and waving banners, a current of euphoria spread among the crowd. Synchronized protests were taking place all across Europe, and for a brief moment, it seemed possible to believe that they would actually make a difference. There was just one problem, as Ishiguro saw it. He worried that the whole thing might be a terrible mistake. In theory, unilateral disarmament was a nice idea. In practice, it could backfire catastrophically. Ishiguro, a mild, deliberative person, didn't want to wake up at the end of his life only to realize that he'd given himself to a misguided cause. Harvey writes that Ishiguro was laden with prizes long before the call from Stockholm came through. But a claim has never stopped him from asking the questions that troubled him on the march in 1983. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm making a terrible mistake? On the evening of December 7th, 2017, he confessed to the audience who gathered to hear his Nobel lecture that he'd begun to wonder whether he'd build his house of fiction on sand. This is Ishiguro himself speaking. I woke up recently to the realization I'd been living for some years in a bubble, he said from behind the guilt-inlaid lectern. I realized that my world, a civilized, stimulating place filled with ironic, liberal-minded people, was in fact much smaller than I'd ever imagined. The raucous discontent that Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump were laying bare had forced him to acknowledge a disturbing reality. The unstoppable advance of liberal humanist values I'd taken for granted since childhood, he said, may have been an illusion. Now he has begun to doubt everything. I grew up in an era when you didn't really ask questions like that, Ishiguro said. But it seems to me that these huge breakthroughs in science and technology are forcing us to go back to them and to ask, what exactly is an individual? Everything, it seems, demands doubt. I would argue even that, in which we put our faith cannot escape acknowledging doubt, whether as we have seen in Genesis or the New Testament. In Mark 15:34, Christ dying on the cross utters a lamentation of profound doubt, here rendered in the voice of the King James translation. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Similarly, if we return to the ancient Greeks and look to the origins of Western theater, we find few assertions of moral certitude. Instead, we see Athenians struggling with a new social order, the state, that conflicts with the pre-existing social structure it seeks to subordinate, the family. That rivalry for preeminence between state and family is often embodied in men who demand that loyalty to society supersede the ancient bonds of the family, nearly always defended by women. There are a few clearer examples of the needs of the state taking precedence over the obligations to the family than Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter, Iphigenia, to gain favorable winds for the Greek assault on Troy. His victorious return home from the war years later is short-lived. Clytemnestra, his wife and Iphigenia's mother, murders her husband in his bath with an axe. Aeschylus may seem to have justified Clytemnestra's vengeance, but he forestalls our sympathy for the mother of a sacrificed daughter by making Clytemnestra as well the adulterous lover of her husband's cousin, Aegisthus, and the murderer of the blameless Cassandra, her husband's enslaved Trojan concubine. The murderer of the blameless Cassandra, her husband's enslaved, the playwright denies his audience the satisfaction of justified vengeance in favor of a drama complicating the judgment of who is in the right. Aeschylus offers us not a moral lesson, but a moral question. Sophocles, too, may give the impression he thinks Antigone is the hero of the final play of his Theban trilogy, even using her name as its title. But critics continue to debate whether Creon, in fact, might be the protagonist. The play counterposes young Antigone and her uncle Creon, the weary king of Thebes. Eteocles and Polynices, Antigone's brothers, have each killed the other in a power struggle from which Creon emerges as king. Creon brands Polynices a traitor and refuses to allow his burial. Antigone, the fiancée of Creon's son, defies the king's edict and attempts to bury her brother, fulfilling her family obligation. Creon, trapped by his own obligations as king, condemns his niece to death for violating his state decree. In response, she commits suicide, and her death is followed in quick succession by the suicides of Creon's son and his wife, who, cursing her husband, kills herself in grief over the loss of her son. Family has its bloody revenge, but the state survives. For Jean Anouilh, staging his adaptation of the play in Nazi-occupied Paris in 1944, Antigone heroically resists the authority of Creon in insisting upon the burial of her brother. Rosamond Deutsch, in her 1946 article on Anouilh's Antigone in the Classical Journal, notes that Anouilh had in mind the German occupation of France when he wrote his Antigone. She describes the French playwright's heroine as an ordinary, determined woman who fights stubbornly and emotionally for freedom of action. However, in the same issue of the journal, Edmund Berry quotes the conclusion of Louis Galantier's program notes for the 1946 production of the play by the National Theatre in Washington. The reader will have to take my word for it that only a citizen of a German-occupied country would be able to come away from the play feeling that Antigone's case was stronger than Creon's. Bernard Knox confirms that assertion when he reports in Historum that at the first performance in Paris in 1944, the play was greeted with applause from both the French and the Germans in the audience. Clearly, even Anouilh's patriotic adaptation of Antigone resulted in a question about contending moral responsibilities, rather than in a conclusion the French playwright forced upon his audience. So the writer's task is neither to criticize nor to proselytize, but to hold up a mirror in which audiences can see their own faces and judge themselves in the stark light literature casts upon our lives. The author's authority does not extend to asserting answers with certainty, but, much like Socrates, to phrasing questions about matters of importance to the community. But how does a writer establish a vocabulary to address new but pressing issues? Innovation often precedes need. An experiment in style or structure that wins an audience may succeed for the moment through its novelty. But such innovation withers and is soon forgotten unless it takes root as a necessary convention in the depiction of ordinary experience, or at least of extraordinary experience. Franz Kafka, for example, died unheralded in 1924, nearly 2 decades before many of his family were lost to the Holocaust. But that almost unthinkable horror, as well as other 20th century bloodshed and state oppression, seemed to demand a new kind of narrative, the type of story we have come to call Kafkan. Though the anxiety Kafka rendered in his highly original novels and short fictions is immediately recognizable as an inescapable constituent of human consciousness, the author's stylistic innovations to capture his profound unease found a fertile bed in recent history. His innovations grew into conventions that now extend beyond literature. When I was poet in residence at the University of Texas at Dallas, a local newspaper editorial, I think it was the Dallas Morning News, decried a bureaucratic tangle citizens faced at City Hall as a Chekhov-like nightmare. The editorialist's error, he or she surely meant a Kafka-like nightmare, illuminates how complex is this process of metamorphosis from innovation to convention. Most educated readers would immediately grasp the implications of an allusion to Kafka in the critique of a bureaucracy. But even if acquainted with the plays of Chekhov, one would probably look up from the paper and a cup of morning coffee to ponder what exactly a Chekhov-like nightmare at City Hall would involve. Though Chekhov's innovations have, I think, taken root as conventions of the modern stage, those methods of characterization and progressions of dialogue are far less obvious than the image of Kafka's monstrously transformed Gregor Samsa, scuttling around his bedroom to the consternation of both family and employers. As was perhaps true with the work of Kafka, sometimes it takes a catastrophe for innovation to find its need. When Vivian Mercier, writing in the Irish Times in 1956, insisted that Samuel Beckett had written in Waiting for Godot, a two-act play, she said this about it. Beckett has succeeded in writing a two-act play in which nothing happens, twice. She was speaking for her own times when she said that. The assumed nihilism of absurdist drama made sense to a generation shaped by both modernist aesthetics and the Depression, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. But half a century later, when a production of Waiting for Godot by the Classical Theater of Harlem was presented among the ruins of New Orleans, audiences turned out literally by the thousands for the two performances. Okay? In fact, 5,000 people showed up to see the first performance in the lower Ninth Ward. The police turned away 3,000 of them. Few of those New Orleanians knew anything about the history of absurdism, nor did they imagine they had come to see a play about nothing. Instead, they sensed that Beckett's tale of two hapless individuals waiting for help that never arrives was a play written about the predicament in which they found themselves here in New Orleans 2 years after defective federal levees had collapsed and destroyed the city. The family of Wendell Pierce, one of the leads in the production, had lost everything in the flooding that followed Hurricane Katrina. As had most of us in the audience, both actor and audience had paced the same ruined landscape as Vladimir and Estragon. In the lower Ninth Ward, and then in a second performance in Chile, just a few blocks from my own mother's destroyed house, Waiting for Godot metamorphosed from a work of absurdism to a work of realism. Once innovation finds its need, audiences no longer recognize it as new. Instead, they simply understand it as part of a language they have already been taught to speak. Unfortunately, it sometimes takes a catastrophe to discover such fluency. So writers were prepared to address the disaster, which was the result not of a hurricane that sideswiped New Orleans, but by the belief in the assurances of the Corps of Engineers that the levees they had designed and built would withstand a Category 1 hurricane, when in fact those levees crumbled in strong Category 1 winds within the city. That failure to doubt the certainty of the US Army Corps of Engineers killed over 1,300 American citizens and nearly destroyed New Orleans. Until last week, I had planned to use Hurricane Katrina as my single example of a major disaster and the response of the arts and humanities to that time of crisis. But what you have endured over the last 14 days in Texas is a more timely example. Artists have not yet had time to fashion a response to your winter disaster. So let us turn from literature to economics to see the dangerous consequences of certainty and the need for doubt. A fundamental axiom of free market capitalism is that an unregulated market is self-correcting, as competitive forces ensure that failures to meet the demands of the market will be supplanted by superior services or products. But as Robin Paul Malloy argues in Mortgage Market Reform and the Fallacy of Self-Correcting Markets, the failure to understand the difference between models and the reality they represent can have catastrophic consequences, as we saw in the Great Recession in 2009, as you experienced last week. Okay? Malloy's argument is that the notions used by economists, or metaphors. And they don't seem to understand that metaphors and the things they represent are not the same thing. And therefore, just to read a bit of what Malloy said, in explaining their models of market behavior, economists often speak in terms of markets as being self-correcting. When one speaks in terms of self-correcting markets, one offers an iteration on Adam Smith's invisible hand metaphor. This means that markets are suggested to be real physical places capable of automatically adjusting to continuously changing circumstances, and doing so in a way that simultaneously maximizes efficiency and wealth for individuals and the public alike. He goes on to demonstrate that both in the economic collapse of 2009 and in other instances, markets don't correct themselves. And in fact, more recently in 2015, Robert Shiller, the Sterling professor of economics at Yale and a self-described free market advocate, published a similar argument in the New York Times entitled "Faith in an Unregulated Free Market? Don't Fall for It," in which he asserts the belief that standard economic theory is typically overenthusiastic about unregulated free markets. It usually ignores the fact that given normal human weaknesses, an unregulated competitive economy will inevitably spawn an immense amount of manipulation and deception. You can judge for yourselves whether the unregulated utilities of your state deserved more scrutiny and skepticism than they received before they left you without power and without order. So what is the future of the arts and humanities in times of crisis? Okay. I would argue that the task is to teach us to doubt. Written in 1919 in the aftermath of World War I, William Butler Yeats' best-known poem, The Second Coming, continues to be true even a century after its composition. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Okay. And I need no illustrations to show you recent examples of the worst demonstrating their passionate intensity. And so perhaps it is not a criticism of the best to accuse them of lacking all conviction. Their lack of certainty, their doubt may be the only thing that saves us in times of crisis. And in the end, I think, is the task of the arts and humanities, educere, to lead us out of ourselves, to doubt. Thank you. And I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Oh, indeed we do. Thank you, first of all, for a wonderful presentation. I think the floor is open for any question. You can either ask your questions in the chat window or by just unmuting yourself. Either way is fine. If you're just trying to stretch your muscles right now and ready yourself for coming up with a good question, then I'll just going to fill in for a moment and just maybe get us going. I think, you know, you started with a very telling example, the film, and the kind of lines there were no evidence, no witness, right? And then you played on this, on the kind of binary of certainty versus uncertainty. The question that I have is whether it's actually visible or not. I mean, the beginning part, you know, of your movie suggests that maybe there are some things that happen for which there's no evidence, nor is there a witness. And even the quote by Camus was, you know, had a qualifier insofar as visible from the interior. And I think we're dealing often with crises that are far harder to see and even harder to name because they're not materializing themselves, maybe always in the ways in which we anticipate, or maybe also in ways in which we've come accustomed to not wanting to see them. So maybe, you know, my question is, certainty and doubt is certainly a strong pairing, but how about inability, like seeing or not seeing, visible or invisible?
A friend of mine, a fellow poet, Roger Kamenetz, has done a lot of work comparing Jewish mysticism to Eastern mysticism, Tibetan mysticism. And in talking with a Lama in Tibet, he explained, you know, I feel as if I'm making progress as a human being, but the one thing I still can't contain is my anger. And the Lama looked at him and said, Roger, you're an intellectual, you doubt everything. Why don't you doubt your anger? And I think part of our problem today is that much of what we're seeing are expressions of emotion. Okay? Particularly in the academy, we're well positioned to refute ideas. But the idea that an emotion can be as stupid as an idea and that is as worthy of criticism as an idea is very difficult for us to grasp or to even believe. If I feel something very passionately, I assume that that provides an authenticity of it, and therefore it's beyond critique. And I think one of the crises we face, really across the whole world, is that we're seeing expressions of emotion that find military or political comfort, okay? But then we can't critique the source, which is emotional. I found over and over again very helpful what Roger told me about that experience. When I get angry, I do stop now and think to myself, is my anger stupid? Is there a basis for the anger I feel? But for the insurgents who tried to stop the election count in January, their emotion was so powerful, it was obvious from the looks on their faces in the films. There is no argument that could have been made to persuade them to stop and go home. Okay. And so I know this doesn't fully answer your question, Niels, but I do think one of our dilemmas is that we're unprepared with our training in terms of intelligence to critique emotion. And much of what we're seeing today are expressions of anxiety, emotion, that gets transmuted into anger, and which can be manipulated, as we see again and again by politicians, into dangerous action.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just cast another look into the round of the different screens and see if someone else wants to join in with another question. I think the faces are popping in and out there, but they're all turning on their respective screens.
I think Sean maybe, or I saw one hand go up.
That was me waving.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, thank you, John, for a really stimulating talk. And I'm working through the ideas, and I'm wondering if I could offer you a scene and then ask how we should either think about this or write about this, and accepting those maybe different answers. And the scene is Trump's call to Georgia to ask them to find some votes. And we have a transcript of this. We have something that's approaching kind of a rough draft for a play. And it seems to me that the one way to describe that scene is him constantly offering up kind of conspiracy theories and things that might have happened, and the Georgia Secretary of State saying, no, that's not what happened. No, the Dominion machines were not left in place, but had their insides changed in the dead of the night, and a variety of series of other things that were kind of improbable. One way to describe that scene would be to say that he was sowing doubt and they were sowing certainty. So is that, and of course I'm kind of offering this as a way that might reverse the polarities of what you're talking about. That I'm more sympathetic in that instance with them, even though I'm kind of tangling with this because I'm so sympathetic for your other examples of the way you presented it. But in this case, I'm thinking, well, no, actually, I'm on the side of certainty, and the side of doubt is simply there to kind of create space long enough for him to get done whatever he wants to get done. So, do we think about that differently? Do we tell that story differently if it were an actual play?
No, it seems to be that all of their hard data did not dissuade Trump in the least. He continued to repeat after that conversation where he'd been presented with evidence that he was dealing in fantasy with the fantasy. It didn't penetrate. He wasn't talked out of his fantasy, out of his conspiracy. My guess is because he believed it. He couldn't emotionally accept the loss. And so he found a way of excusing it. It had to be a robbery. And since his supporters were so devoted to him and they wanted him so much to win, and they very much didn't want the ticket of Biden and Harris to take power, okay, they took resort in emotion I feel this so strongly, those other people are crazy. It must have been fixed. Right? That again, emotion has triumphed over all the data in the world, 60 court cases, it's a really good example you've chosen, very dispassionate laying out of evidence, which proves, this is fantasy. That didn't make the slightest bit of difference to him or his followers. None of it has. And so today, we're at the mercy of that emotion, and our arguments and our proof and our data and our courts are helpless to dissuade tens of millions of Americans of their fervently held belief that we have an illegitimate president, and most importantly, an illegitimate African-American vice president. Yeah. Does that frame it in a way that makes sense to you, Sean? Or
it does make sense to me. It seems so. The tone from the idea that I took from the talk was that a kind of that a response, kind of a broad-based response, or a response on the level of centuries going back to Hesiod, would be to cultivate tolerance and engagement with doubt. And here it sounds like you're saying that this is that, and so I'm trying to make the connection here, because that's not what the Secretary of State of Georgia was doing. They were not asking Trump to cultivate kind of a more ironic sense of his own position. But it sounds like you might be saying that might be, if we were to kind of pursue this more broadly, we have to, as a cultural strategy for dealing with this kind of conviction and fantasy, we would have to somehow engender an affection for, or a sensibility for doubt. So
yeah, and I think that's what our job is in the humanities as teachers. And that's why I counterposed educare and educere. That I think our job as teachers is to lead students out of themselves, to force them to a kind of self-consciousness that they haven't had before, not to form them to confirm the worldview they brought to the classroom. So I'm not talking about a strategy for political change. I'm talking about what teachers can do and what we as individuals must do ourselves to give us a better chance of identifying the problems that we face, particularly projecting what they're going to be and addressing them. So I'm really, this was meant as a talk to teachers and students. What is the task of a College of Arts and Humanities? And I think it's to engender doubt. And a student who has learned how to doubt his or her ideas, and even more powerfully, his or her emotions and worldview, is not going to join the protesters storming the Capitol on January 6th. But I really had the impression that people violating the Capitol had no doubt that they were right. And no evidence was going to change them. If they had gone to the University of Texas College of Arts and Humanities, they wouldn't have gone to Washington to begin with, if you all are doing your job.
Let's hope so. I think we have another question in the chat, but Katie, if you don't mind asking a question yourself, instead of me reading it, since you're there, you just have to unmute yourself. There you are.
I'm here. Sometimes my headphones don't work that well, so please stop me if you can't hear me. My question is, in your comparison, you weren't necessarily comparing Homer and this play that you're referencing that was shown after Katrina, but in seeing those two kind of in the same context, are you suggesting that there needs to be, or could be, the development of a new common culture, and maybe something beyond memes, and that in that development, we can find a path of relevance for the arts and humanities in times of crisis?
Yeah, our difficulty is that we no longer have a common reading. So I can't count on the readers of my fiction or even my poetry to recognize things that would have been obvious 50 years ago. I have a story in which a line recurs, and he alone survived to tell the tale. Well, 50 or 100 years ago, everybody would have recognized the book of Job in that. When I published that story, only my editor in New York and my editor in London recognized the allusion to Job. And the book, lots and lots and lots of reviews, not a single commentator recognized that. So I can't count on, and that's of course the King James reading, I mean, the literary Bible. If I use the most telling line in Job, very, very few readers are gonna see that connection. If I use Homer Simpson, it's gonna work right now, but that means 15 years from now, it's not going to work. In one of my favorite films, Les Enfants de Paradis, Marcel Carné's film, which was shot during the occupation, actually, a prostitute is arrested and a police investigator, a detective, says, "What do you do for a living?" And she says, "I play the violin." And the cop sort of laughs and says, "Yeah, like Monsieur Ingres." It's totally meaningless today. It turns out that in the 19th century, Ingres insisted that he wasn't a great painter, but he was a great violinist, but he had absolutely no musical talent. And so he'd squeak away on his violin and get people to listen to him. So it became a big joke. If you said you could do something and you were terrible at it, you did it like Monsieur Ingres. There's a hole in that film now. I mean, unless I just love that film so much, I tracked it down. But unless you're willing to do a lot of research, that has no meaning. So if I use Homer Simpson today in something I'm writing to as an allusion, I know 30 years from now, that's gone. That's ancient history. It's going to be a hole in my text. So I can't use popular culture, and I can't count on my readers having read the same books I've read. And so I really think allusion is dead. Now, short term, as you're suggesting, we can do memes. But for a writer who's thinking about how will this text read 100 years from now, pop culture is deaf. Does that answer the question you were getting at, Katie?
Yeah, that answers my question. I think I'm wondering also about you're talking about deconstructing.
Oh, yes.
So what do we do? I mean, what is beyond deconstruction? What does it look like to begin to be constructive? And maybe that's happening. I'm just a student, but I'm curious about that part of the conversation. Actually,
a UTD professor and a friend of Rhonda's, Robert Plant Armstrong. In the year that I spent at UTD, we were at a dinner party together. This is 1980. And so he says, "Well, what's happening these days in literary theory among you young people?" I used to be one. And I said, "Well, the French criticism, Derrida, Lacan, deconstructionism." And he said, "Well, what exactly is it?" And I sort of explained it. And he says, "Yeah, everybody reads that way. Everybody but adult." And so what we codified as deconstruction was really just a complex reading, which any educated reader will eventually come to be able to do. But a lot of people thought by giving it a name and devoting themselves to that in particular, that they were somehow advancing the reading of literature. They were popularizing a complex form of reading, I think. Nobody talks about deconstruction today. It has disappeared. The writer writes under erasure, all that's gone. And so I think that, again, that's one of the dangers of not doubting yourself, to commit yourself to deconstruction or the sort of argument that Derrida was making of grammatology. You may be, as Ishiguro was afraid, devoting yourself to something that at the end of your life will seem to have been a mistake. And I would highly recommend Remains of the Day by Ishiguro, about a butler who slavishly serves a master, gives up love, gives up all sorts of things to be the perfect butler, and then discovers at the end of his life the man's a Nazi sympathizer, and he's given up everything for the wrong person. I think that fear comes up again and again in Ishiguro, and is at the heart of doubt. Am I making a mistake?
Thank you. I think you keep everyone's minds busy right now. I can see everyone is kind of working through in their own heads. But let me just ask you one other question. I mean, since you seem to put the emphasis on how much we have to maybe help to make doubt again a bit more popular and make it part of our core mission. How much do we have to doubt ourselves? And in other words, what part do we have to direct it ourselves? How much is our own being part of the process something that we have to recognize, that we come to this in our own individuality in terms of who we are and our gender, our class, our cultural background? Is that something that we have to consider as well?
I think with every decision we make, absolutely. When we win an award, we have to doubt whether we deserve it. When we get rejected,
never, not in those cases. It's always deserved. It's always the best that get them, no doubt.
And and the opposite too. When we get rejected, is this piece nonetheless very successful? To be intellectually honest with oneself in that way, both in his or her daily life and in intellectual matters, I don't know how else to move forward and have any hope of seeing myself as I really am. And not that I will succeed. I mean, you're always going to fail at that. But maybe I'll get a glimpse of myself that's more accurate than if I delude myself with vanity. I'd also say is that the fight that's going on about yesterday, House of Representatives passed a bill outlawing forms of discrimination based on gender. And some Republicans are furious about this. It's because it raises a question about themselves. You want to think of yourself in this very simplistic category. All of a sudden, we've got these categories that really didn't exist as far as they are concerned 50 years ago. It's a real threat to this codified vision of themselves. What we're asking them is to doubt. And that almost always provokes anger. And I think that's part of the crisis.
Well, this is an interesting one. If I may just add one other one, just coming back again to your movie scene and the evidence question. By training, and I think I might have said that I'm a historian, so I deal usually with the things that have already passed, which provides certain challenges insofar as you can only deal with what has remained, what is known. But it's further complicated insofar as I deal with the aftermath of disasters, meaning Holocaust, genocides, and the likes. So there is really a big question as to, if you take Cambodia, the killing fields. I mean, what remains is not a lot there. It's virtually nothing. So how do we at all now in the wider sense in our humanities, how can we at all then kind of engage this without using then something that is maybe innately part of the humanities, imagination? And, I think this is a kind of interesting question that, particularly when it comes to the Holocaust, there's been an ongoing question of the last couple of decades, the authenticity of the remembrance and the extent to which imagination can be useful or harmful to the process. Do you think in your mind that we also have to recognize that the things that we might want to name also are things also that require actually, quote unquote, our imagination more at times than our creativity, than just simply the kind of opening up of the newspaper and the naming or the citing of the document?
As people have said, checking I like on a Facebook post about a political issue accomplishes nothing. That you have to engage it just as the way you're describing it, in fact. Before this began, the Dean and Christy and I were talking about this issue. And I mentioned that in one of my recent books, it's called Silence, it's a nonfiction study of silence. I have a whole chapter on the unspeakable. And I look carefully at what Adorno said, which is, after Auschwitz, no more poetry can be written. We must remain silent. But then a few years later, he changed his mind and said, no, the tortured human being must be allowed to scream. We must be allowed to express ourselves. So the victims certainly have the right to speak. The more complicated question is, what about those of us who come after? Do we have the right to speak? Mm-hmm. And what is it that we must say?
Thank you. I think I'm going to look one more time over all the individual faces and look around. Anybody else who would like to ask a question?
I see a hand. Idea?
Yes. I don't see all the hands always. Oh, there's a hand. Yes, there's one. Yes.
Yes. I'm so curious about what you presented here. So I want to talk about in practical sense. So in such time of crises, as scholars in the field of humanities, what are the practical solutions that we can contribute to help? I may say one suggestion is to raise public awareness, because in what we have witnessed in the last political issue, we faced a big gap between two kinds of people. So as academic institutions, I feel those institutions need to give more to the people to fulfill this gap, because those people are thinking differently, rather or different from the mainstream. So mostly we are surprised about what's going on.
For me, the difficult part of that is my anger. And when I saw what happened on television on January 6th, I was furious. And my first instinct was to dismiss them as idiotic. I mean, they're embracing pure fantasy. There's no basis for what they're feeling. But because I've read Walser and I've read Camus and Ishiguro and many other writers, I had to question my emotions about that. Or are they a different kind of people, basically, that I should feel free to dismiss as evil, or idiotic or something? No, I can't do that. So I think the first step is for me to take them seriously as human beings, and then to ask the question you're raising, which is, so what do we do? And I think we talk. I think we engage. We little by little seed doubt. Saying, well, yeah, I understand your anger, but 60 courts found no evidence of that. And if you're not assaulting the individual in a kind of fight, but opening a dialogue, they're going to have to digest what you've told them. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but maybe because I've taught for 50 years, I don't know what else to do except when I find somebody with whom I disagree deeply, I think I have an obligation to talk to that person, not to dismiss that individual. Does that get to what you were asking, Adia?
Yeah, because I feel academic institutions in some sort are responsible in that, because they didn't give that education to the other side of people, as if they are targeting certain class, but they can't do other things, not the official education, like in meetings, in media, because people are surprised why this happens right away in such a wave. So there is a problem which is hidden and now just show up suddenly.
Well, I think part of that problem is many communities demand educare, using education to form them in the image of their parents, rather than educere, to lead them out. And if the only thing they've heard is confirmation of their worldview that they've gotten at home, okay, somebody has got to offer them a bite of the apple, as they say in Genesis. And I think when educators commit themselves to the full implications of what we try to accomplish in the arts and humanities, that's where it may happen.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, then I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think we want to thank our speaker one more time, John, and remind ourselves next time you see a snake, don't be worried. There's good things that are coming your way.
They tell the truth.
Exactly. And then thank you again all for participating, and we applaud you both with our hands and then also with our electronic pause here. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Same here.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. John, you're staying on for a moment, right?
Sure.